When Dad died, I told my siblings there was nothing left except debt. The silence that followed was louder than grief. I stood alone in the funeral home's dim reception area, staring at the polished oak casket through a wall of glass. The air smelled faintly of lilies and furniture polish. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, my phone vibrated with message after message, none of them offering help. "Not our problem," my sister texted. My younger brother didn't even bother with a message. He simply stopped answering my calls. The oldest sent a long explanation about mortgage payments, school fees, and financial realities. It was remarkable how quickly everyone discovered hardship the moment they believed Dad had died broke. Just 3 days earlier, these same people had spoken passionately about family loyalty. They had promised that when the time came, we would stand together. Now, standing beneath the funeral home's muted lights, I watched those promises collapse one by one. The funeral director sat across from me with folded hands, waiting patiently for decisions that should have belonged to all of us. Instead, every responsibility landed on my shoulders. I felt anger rise, but it never reached the surface, because there was something my siblings didn't know. I had already spoken with Dad's attorney. I already knew the estate wasn't drowning in debt. I already knew every bill was covered, and I already knew exactly why I had told them otherwise. The test wasn't about money. It was about discovering who would still show up when there was nothing left to gain. What happened next revealed more about my family than anything Dad left behind. I'm the middle child, the one people call dependable when they need something, and forget when they don't. For most of my life, that role felt assigned rather than chosen. My older brother was the successful one, always discussing investments and promotions. My sister was the charismatic one, effortlessly gathering attention in every room she entered. I was the person who handled practical problems quietly in the background. When Dad needed help after his knee surgery, I drove him to appointments. When paperwork piled up, I sorted it. When the house needed repairs, I spent weekends fixing things while everyone else promised to help next time. Dad noticed, though he rarely said much. He belonged to a generation that measured love through actions rather than words. We developed an understanding built on shared silences, early morning coffee, and long conversations during drives home from appointments. My siblings often assumed I knew less than they did because I spoke less. They mistook patience for weakness and responsibility for obligation. Family gatherings followed a familiar pattern. They made decisions and I handled consequences. Over time, I stopped correcting their assumptions. People reveal themselves when they believe you have no power. Dad understood that lesson better than anyone. A month before he died, sitting across from me at his kitchen table, he gave me a long look and said something that wouldn't fully make sense until after the funeral. Pay attention to what people do when they think nobody's watching. The days after Dad's death exposed cracks that had been forming for years. At first, the disrespect arrived disguised as concern. My sister called once, her voice soft and measured. She asked how I was holding up, paused for exactly the right amount of time, then shifted the conversation toward finances. "So, there really isn't anything left?" she asked. The question lingered longer than condolences ever had. When I confirmed that Dad's debts appeared to outweigh his assets, the warmth in her voice cooled almost immediately. The silence that followed felt deliberate, as if she were recalculating the value of the conversation. My older brother reacted differently. He listened quietly while I explained funeral costs. I could hear keyboard clicks in the background. He never stopped typing. "That's unfortunate," he said finally. Not "how can I help," not "what do you need," just "unfortunate." Then he mentioned an upcoming business trip and ended the call within minutes. The youngest was the hardest to watch. He had always spoken about family loyalty more passionately than anyone else. Yet when I asked whether he could contribute even a small amount toward the burial, his reply arrived hours later. "Can't do it right now." No explanation. No follow-up. No apology. Over the next week, messages became shorter. Calls went unanswered. Family group chats suddenly fell silent whenever funeral arrangements appeared in the conversation. I noticed everything. The delayed responses, the careful excuses, the way grief seemed secondary to financial disappointment. And with every ignored call, Dad's final lesson became clearer. People weren't revealing themselves because they were angry. They were revealing themselves because they believed there was nothing left to inherit. The turning point came 2 days before the funeral. I was sitting alone in Dad's study, reviewing paperwork after midnight. The room looked exactly as he had left it. His reading glasses rested beside a half-finished crossword puzzle. A cold cup of coffee sat near the window. Outside, streetlights cast pale shadows across the floorboards. For a moment, the grief hit harder than the anger. I wasn't disappointed because my siblings refused to help financially. I was disappointed because they had abandoned Dad before he was even buried. My phone buzzed. A message from my sister appeared on the screen. "Have you checked whether there are any valuables that can be sold?" I stared at the words for a long time. Not a question about the funeral. Not a question about Dad. Just a question about assets. That was the moment something settled inside me. Not rage. Clarity. I opened the folder the attorney had given me weeks earlier. Inside were the documents proving what I had known from the beginning. Dad's estate was completely solvent. Every debt was covered. The house was paid off. There were savings accounts, investments, and enough assets to leave each of us a meaningful inheritance. Dad had spent years building security for his children. Yet the moment they believed there was nothing to gain, they disappeared. I realized then that the test was over. I had seen everything I needed to see. The funeral would go forward exactly as Dad deserved. And afterward, there would be a probate meeting. My siblings would attend expecting answers. Instead, they were about to receive a mirror, one that reflected every choice they had made since Dad died. The week leading up to the probate meeting was surprisingly peaceful. Once I stopped expecting help from my siblings, decisions became easier. I worked closely with Dad's attorney and the probate referee, both of whom had handled estates for decades. Every document was reviewed, every valuation verified, and every financial record organized into a clear timeline. There would be no confusion, no emotional arguments, and no room for anyone to claim they had been misled. Dad had named me executor several years earlier. At the time, my siblings treated the decision as a formality. They assumed it was because I lived closest to him. Now I understood the real reason. Dad trusted me to remain calm when everyone else became emotional. I paid the funeral expenses from my own savings and kept meticulous records of every receipt, invoice, and transaction. Not because I expected reimbursement, but because facts have a way of silencing revisionist history. Meanwhile, I said nothing about the estate. I didn't confront anyone about ignored calls. I didn't argue over cruel messages. I didn't point out who had vanished when responsibility appeared. Instead, I saved everything. The unanswered voicemails. The text saying, "Not our problem." The excuses. The sudden disappearances. My siblings believed the story was already written. Dad died broke and they had moved on. I allowed them to keep believing that, because the strongest position in any conflict is knowledge that others don't realize you possess. All I had to do was wait. Soon, official documents, not emotions, would reveal the truth. And the truth would speak far more effectively than I ever could. The probate meeting took place 3 weeks after. The funeral. We gathered in a conference room, lined with dark wood panels and tall windows overlooking the city. A pitcher of water sat untouched in the center of the table. The atmosphere felt polite, but beneath it I sensed anticipation. For the first time since Dad's death, all 3 of my siblings had arrived early. They smiled. They asked how I was doing. They suddenly seemed interested in family again. I listened without responding much. Then the probate referee opened the file. Page by page, asset by asset, he explained the findings. The estate was completely solvent. The house carried no mortgage. The investment accounts were intact. The savings exceeded expectations. As the numbers accumulated, the room grew quieter. I watched my sister's expression freeze halfway through a sip of water. My older brother stopped taking notes. The youngest stared at the documents as if they belonged to someone else. Then came the question everyone had avoided asking. If everything was covered, my sister said carefully, why were we told there was only debt? For a moment, nobody moved. I reached into my folder and placed several printed pages on the table. Copies of messages, missed calls, excuses, and one text highlighted in yellow. Not our problem. The room became perfectly still. I wanted to know who would help bury Dad if there was nothing to inherit. I said quietly. No accusation followed. None was necessary. The documents spoke for themselves. For the first time, my siblings weren't confronting me. They were confronting the reflection of their own choices. And unlike me, that reflection offered no defense. The consequences arrived quietly. No one stormed out of the room. No dramatic arguments erupted across the table. Reality settled over my siblings much the way dust settles after something breaks. My sister looked down at her phone, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The confidence she carried into the meeting had disappeared. My older brother tried explaining that he had been under pressure. That work and family responsibilities had complicated everything. Even he seemed unconvinced by his own words. The youngest said almost nothing. His silence hurt the most because he had always spoken about loyalty. Now he sat staring at the highlighted text message as though seeing it for the first time. The attorney didn't comment. The probate referee didn't need to. Everyone in the room had witnessed the same thing. Over the following weeks, messages began arriving regularly. Invitations appeared. Apologies surfaced in different forms. Some were sincere. Others felt motivated by embarrassment. But something fundamental had changed. Trust, once broken, does not return simply because circumstances improve. Their reputation suffered less in public than in private. They now had to live with the knowledge that when Dad needed them most, they chose convenience over responsibility. As for me, the greatest change wasn't financial. It was personal. For years, I had wondered whether I expected too much from people. Now I knew the answer. The reason this matters goes beyond inheritance or family conflict. Everyone eventually discovers who values them, and who values what they can provide. The difference can change the course of a life. In the months that followed, I stopped measuring family by words. I started measuring it by presence. Some relationships survived, others didn't. My younger brother eventually apologized, not with grand speeches, but with honesty. He admitted that he had assumed someone else would handle everything. My sister continued reaching out, though our conversations never quite returned to what they once were. The oldest remained polite but distant, as if accepting responsibility would require confronting parts of himself he preferred not to examine. I didn't cut anyone off. I simply stopped carrying people who refused to walk beside me. Dad's estate was settled fairly. Each beneficiary received exactly what he intended. I honored every instruction in his will, knowing he had spent a lifetime building something meant to outlast him. As for me, the experience changed more than my relationships. It changed my understanding of self-worth. For years, I had mistaken being needed for being valued. They aren't the same thing. Being needed ends when the task is complete. Being valued remains when there is nothing left to gain. Sometimes I still visit Dad's grave on quiet mornings. I bring coffee, sit beneath the old maple tree nearby, and tell him how things are going. The conversations are one-sided now, but somehow I leave feeling lighter every time. In the end, the inheritance that mattered most wasn't the money, the house, or the investments. It was the lesson Dad left behind. When the promise of reward disappears, the people who remain are the people who truly loved you.